Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears. I've come to bury Caesar, not to praise him. My father was the kind of man that deserves that kind of epic speech. It gives you great joy that so many of you recognized it right away. As we said, he grew up an orphan, having been dropped at that St. Francis home for boys, or better details earlier. Couldn't have been an easy childhood, but he really didn't think of it that way. He talked about playing in the rafters and about being in trouble with the nuns.
Amen.
In 2011, a fire broke out in that building, which had been a Detroit public school for 20 years, and eventually they had to tear it down. I suspect that there were boys playing underneath that wooden roof, literally following in my father's footsteps, making mischief. My dad had a lot of stories. I'll never know which of them were true, which of them had a grain of truth, and which were invented out of whole cloth. He had a vivid imagination, and he knew a good story when he had one. When we'd talk on the phone after I moved to Washington, we'd slip into a little game where he'd ask me about the advice that I'd given to the president. I'd never tried one of them. And we would pretend as though we were those important men who would talk about the issues of the day. You know, heck, even some of my stories about my father, like the line about if you can't sing well, at least sing loud. I don't know if I invented the quote and then we shared it from the rest, or if it had been there all along. But I know he liked it, and it really suited him. I get to do a lot of public speaking with my volunteer activities, and probably the best speech that I ever gave was based on him. I was working on a volunteer event we do in DC public schools where we do a whole lot of things, thousands of people helping out. And it was at that moment when you don't know if you can pull it off. And I remembered that old State Fair stand. It was a crazy, handmade construction that, in my memory, was 15 or 18 feet tall. The photos I've seen make it look a little more human. But it was still big. It had a slope roof, and you had to manhandle all the different parts into position. And there were no plans. And every year we'd go out there, and he'd get everyone together and put it up. For this volunteer group, I embellished a little. And I had him giving... there we go. I had him giving a speech every year, which I think he would do now. And he'd say, you know, we've done this 15 times. It's always difficult, and every time it's different. Every time when we finish, there are different parts left over. But every time that we start, we finish. And we can do this. Because it was the same way for my volunteer group. There were always different parts left over. It was never the same. But everybody pitched in and made it happen. And I know this is a good speech, not just because of the wonderful reaction here, but because I have friends who were at that meeting who asked me when we've been together to give the speech again. I gave it to my dad, and he agreed that it was a good speech. And I think he was appreciative that he could help, even without being there. Back on those fairgrounds, when he would walk those fairgrounds, everyone was his friend. You'd see him greeting people, shaking hands and waving. He was no politician, but he was a man you couldn't help but like. In my better moments, I'm like my father, relentlessly unafraid of people and gregarious. In other moments, I'm the shy boy who's afraid to pick up the phone. He had, as we've noted, a great outlook on life. Always seeing the bright side and always seeing the best in people. We used to help out sometimes at those fairs, the free labor that the farmer had gotten out of him, he thought he was going to get for us for free. My mother ensured that he did pay us. But he had the most interesting people working for him. I'm not sure that all of those people could have other jobs any other time of the year. So in a sense, maybe he was doing them a favor, but they would come out of the woodwork, no matter what condition they were in or where he was at, and they would show up because Russ was there and it was fair time. And they would bust their butts for my old man, and he paid them. So he got what he wanted, and they got what they wanted. And they got respect. He taught me that when you expect good things of people, and they know it, good things happen. I met my wife, Melissa, back in 2002. And the old man had told me he wasn't going to keep working the fair forever. It was maybe a few more years, probably after next year. So I came to town and I brought Melissa with me. She told me when we came, she said, you know, I would like to work the stand for a day with you as well. He was not so sure about that. I mean, Charlene worked days there. My sister worked there. You know, all of the family had helped out, but he wasn't so sure. Because it is really, really hard work. But she was persistent, and he let her do it. Now, he had a way about him when he wanted to think and convey himself as a grand thinker, to put his chin in his hand and stand there sagely. And at the end of the day, when Melissa had worked the whole day and loved every minute of it, he stood there and he nodded. He was surprised she'd done it, impressed with her. And he let me know that I'd gotten the right gal, and he was proud. We talked about his craze for fitness. One of the early memories I have is of him deciding that he was going to run at night in Detroit. And there weren't a lot of street lights, but we had a family car. And so he was running in the street, and my mother was driving behind him. And in later years, sometimes he liked to rechannel that judo stuff that he was doing. And to be funny, he'd go into his stance and go, yeah! Or something like that. I can't do the right hands right. I didn't do judo. But he just had such a vigorous sense about him, yet that humor where he was almost, you know, making a caricature of himself, but he shared the laugh with everyone. In his Coast Guard career, he served as part of the deck crew on the Coast Guard cutter Mackinac, cruising the Great Lakes, breaking ice. It was a particularly harsh winter, and one day, when the crew was assembled on deck, they called for volunteers to help in the kitchen. My dad was no fool. The kitchen was inside. His hand shot up, and that became his lifetime love of cooking to fit well with his lifetime love of food. After after a few months in the galley, the captain called him to his quarters. The Coast Guard has a cooking school in Washington, D.C., and it was routine for everyone who served as a cook in the Coast Guard to attend that school. The captain liked how hard Navarre worked. And so he asked him, he said, "Navarre, you already know how to cook, right?" And what, my friends from the Coast Guard, do you think he said? He said, "Yes, sir." Or maybe it's aye, aye, sir. Is Coast Guard aye, aye, sir? Aye, aye, sir. And he never got any formal training at all. Later, when he was posted to Grand Marais, where there were only 7 guys, and to get to the town from the Coast Guard station, you had to walk across the Marais. My brother has studied French, as I have a little bit. A marais is a swamp. So you had to kind of walk across this boggy ground to get to town. There were no cars driving out there, no supply trucks. You carried everything back and forth there. So it was a difficult posting. And he served as the cook there. He went out, he bought himself cookbooks and taught himself how to cook. I always joke that I learned how to cook for 500, but I had a real hard time cooking for 2. I married a chef, basically. He also played, my brother mentioned basketball. My dad played semi-pro basketball when he was there at the Coast Guard station. They had to leave one guy at the station, so they would play local high schools and teams from the area with one guy on the bench. My father was a terrible basketball player. He learned how to play before they invented the jump shot. When I was in college, I took basketball coaching and advanced basketball coaching. I wrote a paper on basketball strategies in the 1920s, because there were books published even then on how to coach basketball. And one of the strategies that it recommended was for a player to run into the corner of the court and to take the ball with both hands and pitch it in the general direction of the basket. And this was a designed play. That was vintage Russ Navarre. So in the late 1970s, I was in middle school with the sons of Bob Lanier and Monty Clark. My father played in the father-son game alongside a professional basketball player and the head coach of the Lions. He had a blast. He ran up and down the court, high-fiving with the other guys. Because all they had to do was toss the ball to Bob, and he scored on it. Though sometimes his athleticism showed through, even as a dad. We lived across the street from the Altenbergers, and one day he went golfing with George Altenberger. Mr. Altenberger, as I recollected, golfed regularly and had a beautiful set of clubs. My father had something he picked up at a flea market. I'm not certain that he had the regulation number of clubs. I'm pretty sure he didn't, because I think I used that set at one point. He didn't just beat George Altenberger. He destroyed him. I think that Mr. Altenberger threw his clubs in the creek, or at least wanted to. He tried to teach Rob and I how to play golf. The first time that we went, I hit my younger brother twice with the golf club. And I shot a 96 on the front nine. You know, there are some people who only know him from his batter mix, and they loved him for who he was. He walked in the door in a fish fry shop or a restaurant, and from the moment he went in, he was selling. He'd get them to let him fry up some of their fish with his batter mix or some mushrooms. I love those freaking mushrooms. And he would sell them. Every client he had bought Russ Navarre. In a package, Russell mix. But they were buying it because he sold them on it. He sold all of us on lots of things. Because he was a great, great salesman. You know, at funerals and around this time, or, you know, when I played a baseball game yesterday, not to brag, and I told the guys, oh, yeah, my father's passed away, and people say, you know, I'm sorry for your loss. And when we had dinner with some friends the other night, I thanked Ed for saying that because I appreciate it. But I said, you know, Ed, I really feel sorry for you because you didn't get to meet him. He was larger than life. He loved people and they loved him back. Let me close where we started, with Mark Antony, Eulogy, Isaac, Caesar. But here I am to speak what I do know. You all did love him once, not without cause. What cause withholds you then to mourn for him? Bear with me, my heart is in the coffin there with Caesar, and I must pause till it come back to me. I'm going to miss you, Dad.